The day Evelyn Cross walked out, Nolan Avery was still gripping a handrail, trying to take 3 steps on legs that refused to remember how to hold him. She left her wedding ring on the nightstand, a separation agreement already signed, and a note explaining that she could not bury her whole life beside a man who might never stand on his own again. 7 years later, Nolan could walk, could run his own company, and could raise their daughter without help from anyone. He had turned the very device that saved his legs into a business worth nearly $60 million, and he was one signature away from the biggest contract of his career. That was the exact morning Evelyn came back, not with an apology, but with a lawsuit demanding half of everything he had built without her. Subscribe now, because this trial is about to reveal who truly saved Nolan and who only wants to steal the life he rebuilt alone. 7 years earlier, Nolan Avery woke inside a hospital room in Briar Glen, Colorado, with a body that no longer obeyed him below the waist. The doctors were careful with their words, refusing to promise he would walk again, but refusing just as firmly to say he never would. For the first few weeks, Evelyn stayed close, holding his hand through the worst of the pain, but something in her began to shift the moment a therapist mentioned the word years instead of months. She stopped attending his physical therapy sessions one by one, first citing traffic, then work, then simple exhaustion, until her absence became the pattern rather than the exception. She complained quietly about hospital bills, about parking fees, about the apartment she still had to manage alone, and she stopped bringing their daughter, Lila, to visit her father at all. The rehabilitation gym smelled faintly of rubber mats and antiseptic, a smell Nolan had come to associate with both dread and stubborn hope in equal measure. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and somewhere behind him a machine hissed rhythmically. That's the way a clock counts down a life sentence. On the afternoon that mattered most, Nolan gripped 2 parallel bars and forced his legs into 3 shaking, agonizing steps, the kind of victory that should have belonged to both of them. Sweat gathered along his spine, his arms trembled from the effort of holding his own weight upright, and every nerve below his hips screamed in protest at the demand being placed on them. He turned toward the small visitor area where family members usually sat, searching for the one face he needed to see, and found only an empty chair with a coffee cup still cooling on the armrest. When he returned to his room that evening, dragging his exhausted body through the doorway, he found his wedding ring sitting neatly on the nightstand beside a folder of signed separation papers. Tucked between the pages was a short letter, written in Evelyn's careful handwriting, explaining that she could not spend her life waiting to see if he would ever again resemble the man she married. She had already arranged for their daughter to remain in his custody, framing it not as abandonment but as her own inability to offer stability while she rebuilt her separate life. Nolan did not cry out or beg her to return, because something quieter and harder had already begun forming in his chest, a decision to rebuild everything from nothing. During one difficult therapy session not long after, a support strap on his walking frame slipped at the worst possible moment, sending him crashing hard against the padded floor. Lying there, staring up at fluorescent lights, Nolan realized the device beneath him had been designed for hospital efficiency, not for the fear and uncertainty of the person using it. He reached for a pen and, on the back of the very separation papers Evelyn had left behind, sketched a small sliding joint meant to catch a person the instant their balance failed. Dr. Celeste Harlan, the physical therapist overseeing his recovery, noticed the drawing pinned near his bed during a routine visit and studied it with unusual interest. She asked him plainly whether he was trying to fix a broken walking frame or whether he was quietly designing something that had never existed before. Nolan did not have an answer that day, but the question stayed with him longer than any prognosis the doctors had given. In the months that followed, Nolan moved into a small apartment near the rehabilitation center. close enough that he could walk there on his hardest days and be carried there on his worst ones. His mornings belonged to therapy, grueling and repetitive, while his nights belonged to a growing stack of sketches spread across a second-hand kitchen table. His sister helped care for Lila during those earliest, most uncertain months, but Nolan refused to let anyone else carry the full weight of fatherhood, insisting on being present for every meal he could manage. Celeste helped him apply for a small, independent rehabilitation grant worth $12,000, money meant to fund exactly the kind of invention he was quietly building in secret. A local machinist named Jonas Pike agreed to fabricate his early prototypes, refusing payment outright once he learned how close Nolan's accident settlement was to running dry. Word of a strange, determined man building his own recovery device began to spread quietly through the rehabilitation community, long before anyone called it a company. Nolan's kitchen table was permanently covered in graphite dust and coiled steel shavings, and Lila often fell asleep on the couch nearby, lulled by the quiet scrape of a file against metal. He learned to test his own patience the same way he tested his own balance, one small failure at a time, refusing to let frustration become an excuse to stop. The first prototypes failed in almost every way a machine could fail, collapsing under too much weight, jamming at the joints, forcing patients to depend on a technician for every single movement. Each failure taught Nolan something his own body already knew, because he tested every version on himself first, cataloging the exact moment his balance betrayed him. By the fifth working prototype, patients could lean on the frame for support while still controlling their own motion, catching themselves instead of being caught. Nolan named the device AstorStep, borrowing the name from a wildflower known for blooming again after the harshest winter ended. A small rehabilitation center agreed to run a limited trial, and the results were not miraculous, but they were undeniable, with patients reporting steadier confidence and fewer dangerous falls. Therapists noticed they could safely support more patients at once, since AstorStep reduced the physical strain their own bodies once absorbed during every session. Nolan formally founded Astor Mobility alongside Jonas and a small handful of early believers, refusing to take a salary himself for the entire first year of operation. Growth was slow and unglamorous, built on grant applications, small hospital contracts, and long nights spent perfecting manufacturing tolerances that most people would never notice. By the third year, the company finally turned a profit, modest but real, enough to hire a proper engineering team and expand beyond a single rented workshop. By the seventh year, AstorStep was being used inside 46 rehabilitation centers across 3 states, quietly changing how patients relearned to walk. Nolan himself still needed a cane on cold mornings, still felt sharp nerve pain by the end of long days, and still attended physical therapy sessions he no longer needed to hide from anyone. He had built a company not despite his injury, but because of everything his injury had taught him about fear, balance, and the courage required to take a single step. Now, 7 years after Evelyn left, Nolan stood on the edge of the largest deal his company had ever pursued, a nationwide partnership with the Horizon Care Hospital Network that could bring AstorStep into hundreds of new facilities. His legal team had finalized every document, his engineers had prepared every shipment schedule, and Nolan had allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something close to certainty. On the morning the contract was scheduled to be signed, he opened his front door expecting a courier with routine paperwork, only to be handed a thick legal envelope instead. Inside, beneath dense formal language he had to read twice to understand, was the name of the plaintiff bringing a lawsuit against him and against everything he had spent 7 years building. The name printed at the top of the filing was Evelyn Cross, the same woman who had once said she could not stay beside a man who might never walk again. The lawsuit accused Nolan of breaching an unwritten partnership agreement, concealing marital assets, erasing a co-founder from company records, and using shared marital resources to develop Aster Step. Evelyn demanded the court freeze any transfer of company shares and halt the Horizon Care contract entirely until ownership of the technology could be legally resolved. She insisted the earliest ideas behind the device had emerged while they were still married, and that she deserved recognition and compensation for a company built on what she called shared sacrifice. Her initial evidence included an old photograph of Nolan sketching mechanical parts at their kitchen table, a text message she had once sent calling the device life-changing, and a document titled Founder Agreement bearing a signature that looked remarkably like his own. Leah Marlowe, the commercial attorney representing Nolan, warned him immediately that this fight could stretch on for months, draining both money and public confidence in the company. Horizon Care could not finalize any contract while ownership of the underlying technology remained legally contested, and investors were already beginning to whisper uneasy questions among themselves. One board member quietly urged Nolan to settle quickly, arguing that a prolonged legal battle could collapse the Horizon Care deal entirely regardless of who eventually won in court. Nolan felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, knowing full well that Evelyn had contributed nothing to the years of failed prototypes, sleepless nights, and painful therapy sessions that built his company. Many of his earliest records, however, were still stored in boxes at the old rehabilitation center rather than neatly filed at his current office, leaving frustrating gaps in his immediate defense. At a court-ordered mediation meeting, Evelyn arrived wearing an expensive tailored coat, calm and composed, insisting she had no interest in destroying the company he had built. She claimed she only wanted what was rightfully hers, describing her departure years earlier not as abandonment, but as one of the hardest sacrifices of her entire life. Nolan reminded her plainly that she had left before a single working prototype ever existed, long before Aster Step became anything more than a sketch on borrowed paper. Evelyn's voice turned cold as she replied that she had left a man who could not cross a room on his own, not a company now worth $60 million, as though the timing of her departure erased the difference. As she walked out of the mediation room, a sleek black car sat waiting at the curb, its rear door already open for her arrival. The man who stepped out to greet her was not a friend or a family member, but Damian Blackwood, the billionaire chief executive of a rival medical device company. Leah later confirmed that Evelyn could not possibly afford the aggressive legal team suddenly representing her, since their usual clients belonged almost exclusively to Blackwood Biomechanics. 2 years earlier, Damian had personally offered $18 million to purchase Aster Mobility outright, an offer Nolan flatly refused for several important reasons. He rejected the price as insultingly low and rejected even more firmly Damian's stated plan to raise device prices and shut down Jonas's small manufacturing workshop entirely. Not long after that failed acquisition attempt, Blackwood Biomechanics quietly developed its own competing walking device, only to watch it fail in clinical trials due to excessive complexity and unmanageable cost. Damian understood that the Horizon Care contract would transform Aster Mobility into a direct, unavoidable threat to his company's remaining hospital relationships nationwide. A lawsuit over company ownership offered him something far more valuable than a courtroom victory, since it could delay the contract, lower the company's valuation, and frighten away nervous investors. Nolan wanted to publicly expose the connection between Evelyn and Damian immediately, but Leah cautioned him against acting before they had solid proof of any formal arrangement. The court soon issued an order preserving all relevant documents and temporarily blocking any sale of the company, though daily operations were still permitted to continue. Horizon Care gave Nolan exactly 30 days to resolve the dispute, warning that the contract would otherwise be redirected straight to Blackwood Biomechanics instead. Days later, Damien arrived personally at the Astor Mobility offices, presenting himself as a peacemaker, offering a generous, dignified way out of the entire conflict. He proposed purchasing the company for $24 million, promising that Evelyn would withdraw her lawsuit the moment the sale was finalized between them. Nolan would remain, he suggested, as a paid advisor for 2 years, allowed to walk away with both money and a measure of public credit intact. Damien added, almost gently, that Nolan should feel grateful for the chance to leave with his reputation and his finances still mostly whole. Nolan understood immediately that such a specific, confident offer could only mean one thing: that Damien already believed Evelyn's lawsuit was fully within his control from the very beginning. He looked directly at the older man and said quietly that Blackwood did not want his technology because it was better, but because his own company's technology had already proven it could never compete. Damien did not deny the accusation, choosing instead to glance briefly at the cane resting beside Nolan's chair before speaking again in an unbothered tone. His voice never rose, never sharpened into anything as crude as a threat, because men like Damien had learned long ago that quiet words could do far more damage than loud ones. He told Nolan that he had clearly learned how to stand back up once, and suggested it would be a shame if someone had to teach him how to fall a second time. Then he straightened his jacket, offered a polite, empty smile, and walked out through the same doors he had entered, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any argument could have. Not long afterward, Evelyn's legal team submitted a formal document titled Founder Agreement, bearing what appeared to be Nolan's genuine signature across the bottom of the page. The text claimed Evelyn had contributed the original concept, that both parties jointly owned every resulting design, and that she was entitled to 40% of all commercial profits going forward. The signature looked convincingly authentic, and Nolan insisted repeatedly that he had never seen the document before, let alone signed it willingly. Handwriting analysts could not immediately confirm forgery, since the file had only been submitted as a digital scan rather than an original physical page. Evelyn explained calmly that the original document had been lost somewhere during one of her many moves after the divorce, a detail Leah found suspiciously convenient. She also produced an old photograph showing Nolan sketching a complex metal mechanism at their kitchen table, though he could not immediately place exactly which design it depicted. The Astor Mobility Board of Directors began splitting sharply into cautious factions, unsettled by the sudden appearance of a signed document that could threaten the entire company's ownership structure. One nervous investor suggested Nolan temporarily step aside as chief executive, framing the move as a way to protect the company rather than punish him personally. Nolan felt something painful settle in his chest, the sensation of watching his own body's sacrifice slowly get written out of the very thing it had created. Leah urged him to think back carefully through every document he had signed during those first disoriented weeks after his accident, when medication and exhaustion blurred entire days together. As Nolan studied the disputed signature more closely, he noticed a strange, trembling, tilted quality in the pen strokes, a style he had only ever used during those very first painful weeks. Back then, he had signed dozens of hospital consent forms with an unsteady hand, still adjusting to medication that made his fingers shake uncontrollably. Leah began to suspect that his authentic signature had somehow been lifted from an old medical consent form and carefully transplanted onto an entirely different document. The court soon ordered both parties to surrender relevant electronic devices and communication records connected to the growing dispute between them. Evelyn claimed her old phone from that period had broken years earlier and could not be recovered or examined by either legal team. Meanwhile, Damien's attorneys aggressively objected to any request for Blackwood's internal financial records, insisting their company had no direct connection to a private marital dispute. Frustrated but persistent, Dr. Celeste Harlan began searching through her own old hospital files for anything that might clarify the timeline of events. She eventually located a genuine original document bearing that same shaky, unmistakable signature, though it was not the founder agreement everyone had expected to find. It was, instead, a simple medical authorization form, one that had quietly granted Evelyn permission to access and remove copies of Nolan's private hospital records years earlier. Celeste held the page under the desk lamp for a long moment, comparing the tremor in the ink stroke by stroke against the disputed founder agreement, until there could be no honest doubt left between them. She called Leah immediately, her voice tight with the particular kind of urgency that comes from realizing a lie has finally run out of places to hide. Leah immediately began rebuilding a complete timeline using therapy journals, invoices from Jonas's workshop, funding paperwork, private emails, and dated video footage of the earliest prototype tests. Every single document confirmed that AstroStep's functional design had emerged only after the date Evelyn had signed their original separation agreement. When investigators enlarged the disputed kitchen table photograph, they discovered the sketch inside it was not AstroStep at all, but an unrelated packaging machine part from Nolan's previous engineering job. A corner of the image had been carefully cropped to remove the old company logo, subtly altering the entire meaning of the photograph. Jonas produced old text messages showing that Evelyn had once flatly refused to drive a bag of spare parts to his workshop when Nolan asked for her help. In those messages, she had dismissively called the components scrap metal and told Nolan to stop wasting money on a dream meant for people who could not simply return to normal. Nolan initially resisted having those private messages made public, worried that Lila might someday read the cruel words her mother had written about him during his hardest years. Leah reassured him that the court could seal unnecessary portions of the record, using only the specific language that directly addressed company ownership and contribution. Nolan agreed reluctantly, insisting firmly that the trial should never become an attack on Evelyn's character as a mother, regardless of what she had done to him personally. His goal, he told Leah quietly, was only to prove she was never a co-founder, not to prove she had been a failure as a parent. Celeste testified next, confirming that she herself had first encouraged Nolan to commercialize his invention and that Evelyn had never once attended a single planning meeting. The earliest funding, she explained clearly, had come entirely from an independent rehabilitation grant and Nolan's private accident settlement, with no shared marital assets involved anywhere in that process. Records further revealed that Evelyn had accessed detailed technical descriptions of the device through the very medical authorization she had once used to remove Nolan's hospital files. This discovery finally explained how she had known enough specialized terminology to construct a convincingly detailed lawsuit in the first place. Leah then uncovered something even more damaging, an email showing Evelyn had forwarded that same technical description to an address belonging directly to Blackwood Biomechanics. The forwarded email had been sent only 3 weeks before Evelyn filed her lawsuit, a timeline that immediately raised serious new questions inside the courtroom. During a formal deposition, Evelyn confidently repeated her original claims, insisting she had personally chosen the name AstroStep and helped identify the company's earliest target customers. She further claimed she had contributed personal savings toward development costs and that Nolan had once verbally promised her a permanent share of company ownership. Leah calmly asked her to explain several basic technical distinctions, testing whether her knowledge matched someone who had genuinely helped design the device. Evelyn struggled visibly, unable to distinguish an old industrial blueprint from a weight-bearing support mechanism, a safety locking system, or an actual working prototype. When pressed about the specific financial contribution she claimed to have made, Evelyn cited a $5,000 transaction pulled from an old shared account. Complete bank statements later revealed that money had actually been withdrawn to cover a security deposit on Evelyn's own new apartment, never once reaching Nolan or his fledgling company. Leah then asked directly about Evelyn's relationship with Damian Blackwood, watching her composure falter for the first time during the entire deposition. Evelyn admitted only that Blackwood had generously helped cover her legal expenses, insisting this support came purely from his concern for basic fairness in her situation. She firmly denied ever promising to sell her claimed company shares to Damian, or coordinating any part of her lawsuit with his broader business interests. After that difficult session ended, Evelyn approached Nolan privately, telling him they both knew she would never have returned if his company had ultimately failed. She argued, almost reasonably, that Nolan would never have found the motivation to build something so successful had she not left him when she did. By her own strange logic, her cruelty years earlier had somehow forged his strength, and that sacrifice, however painful, entitled her to a rightful share of everything he now had. Nolan did not raise his voice or argue the point further, choosing instead to answer her with a single quiet sentence that ended the conversation entirely. He told her that a person who pushes someone else into deep water does not get to claim credit later for teaching them how to swim. Just when the case seemed to be tilting firmly in Nolan's favor, a former company accountant came forward with damaging new testimony that threatened everything Leah had carefully built. The accountant testified that Aster Mobility's earliest paperwork had used their old shared marital address as an official mailing location during company formation. Evelyn's legal team seized on this detail immediately, arguing it proved the company had technically begun taking shape while the couple was still legally married. Leah discovered inconsistent dates scattered across several old formation documents, inconsistencies that could seriously complicate their entire defense strategy going forward. If Evelyn's team could convincingly prove company preparations began before the separation, the court's decision could become far less predictable than anyone had hoped. Late one evening, reviewing old business filings, Nolan came across his own genuine signature on a business name registration dated just 3 weeks before Evelyn walked out the door. This time, unlike the disputed founder agreement, the signature staring back at him was completely, unmistakably real. Nolan quietly remembered registering an entity called Aster Industrial Design months before his accident, a name meant only for small freelance engineering jobs unrelated to medical devices. That earlier company had nothing to do with rehabilitation technology, existing solely to handle contract work Nolan occasionally picked up on the side. Later, his accountant had simply reused portions of that old paperwork when formally establishing Aster Mobility, creating an unintended paper trail connecting two entirely separate ventures. Evelyn's team exploited this coincidental overlap in names, arguing the current company should legally be treated as a direct continuation of one formed during their marriage. Leah warned Nolan that while the court seemed unlikely to grant Evelyn ownership of any patents, it might still award her a partial stake in the company's original founding value. With only 10 days remaining before Horizon Care would redirect their contract elsewhere, the pressure on Nolan intensified from every direction at once. Employees throughout Aster Mobility grew increasingly anxious about their jobs, whispering nervously about layoffs should the lawsuit ultimately succeed against the company they had helped build. Nolan felt the full weight of responsibility for dozens of families whose livelihoods now depended entirely on decisions being made inside a courtroom. Damian returned one final time with what he framed as his last generous offer, proposing $30 million for full ownership of Aster Mobility. Part of that payment, he explained, would settle Evelyn's claims permanently, while Nolan himself would keep an honorary advisory title and Jonas's workshop would remain open for 6 additional months. Several board members quietly urged Nolan to accept the offer, arguing it represented the only guaranteed way to protect the company's remaining employees from total collapse. Jonas warned him bluntly that Blackwood would shut down the workshop the moment that 6-month guarantee legally expired, leaving nothing behind for the people who trusted him most. Nolan seriously considered selling, terrified that his own stubborn principles might ultimately cost other people their jobs and their sense of security. During a brief phone call that week, Lila asked her father quietly why he had missed her recent school performance, her voice small and disappointed over the line. Nolan did not mention the lawsuit at all, choosing instead to simply apologize for letting his fear of losing everything pull him away from a promise he had made to her. Lila told him gently that she did not need him to win every single battle. She only needed him to come home exactly when he said he would. Nolan sat alone in his car outside the office for several minutes after the call ended, staring at nothing, letting her voice settle over the noise crowding his mind. Something in her simple, honest words steadied him more than any legal strategy Leah had proposed throughout the entire case. He thought of every night he had chosen a wrench over sleep, every therapy session he had gritted through alone, and realized none of it had ever been about proving anything to Evelyn at all. Nolan ultimately refused Damien's final offer outright, telling his board that if he lost this fight, he would rebuild everything from nothing all over again. He would not, he said firmly, hand his life's work to a corporation determined to turn it into a luxury only wealthy patients could ever afford. Shortly afterward, while reviewing newly surrendered financial documents, Leah discovered a private litigation funding agreement linking Evelyn directly to an obscure shell company. Tracing the ownership records carefully, she found that the ultimate owner behind that shell company was, unmistakably, Damien Blackwood himself. The agreement stated plainly that if Evelyn won her case or forced Nolan into any forced sale of the company, Blackwood would immediately receive the right to purchase all remaining shares at a fixed, predetermined price. Evelyn, according to the same document, would only be paid her full settlement once Astor Mobility formally passed into Damien's hands. The trial finally opened inside the commercial courthouse in Briar Glen, drawing a small but attentive crowd curious about the once quiet inventor now fighting for everything he owned. Wooden benches creaked under shifting weight, sunlight slanted through tall windows onto polished floors, and the low murmur of the gallery fell silent the instant the judge entered the room. Nolan sat with his cane resting against his knee, his hands steady on the table in front of him, refusing to let nerves show on his face, even as his pulse hammered beneath his collar. Evelyn told a carefully constructed story, portraying herself as a devoted young wife who had sacrificed her own future caring for an injured husband. She insisted Nolan had deliberately erased her name from company records the very moment his invention finally began generating real financial value. Leah made a deliberate choice not to attack the fact that Evelyn had once left the marriage, refusing to turn the trial into a referendum on her character. Instead, she focused the entire defense around 4 precise questions the jury needed to answer clearly before reaching any verdict. Who actually created the design? When exactly was it created? Whose money funded the earliest working prototype? And who stood to profit most from this particular lawsuit? Celeste took the stand and calmly confirmed, with dated records in hand, that the completed functional design had emerged only after Evelyn's departure from the marriage. Jonas testified next, stating plainly that Evelyn had never once visited his workshop during the entire period the earliest prototypes were being built. A forensic document expert explained to the jury how Nolan's genuine, trembling signature had been carefully extracted from an old medical form and inserted into the disputed founder agreement. The cropped kitchen table photograph was digitally restored before the jury's eyes, revealing the hidden company logo that exposed its true, unrelated origin. An accountant clarified the confusing overlap between Aster Industrial Design and Aster Mobility, explaining they were entirely separate legal entities with completely different purposes. The original separation agreement itself contained a clear clause stating both parties permanently waived any claim to income or intellectual property created after its signing date. Records confirmed that Evelyn had already received the marital home, a substantial share of their combined savings, and an additional settlement payment specifically in exchange for accepting that very waiver clause. When questioned again about her relationship with Damien, Evelyn insisted he had only ever supported her out of a genuine belief in basic fairness and justice. Leah then formally introduced the litigation funding agreement into evidence, watching visible discomfort spread across Evelyn's face for the very first time. Evelyn continued denying any deliberate plan to help Blackwood seize control of the company, though her explanations grew noticeably thinner with each passing question. A former assistant of Damien's then delivered the most damaging testimony of the entire trial, presenting a legally recorded meeting stored within Blackwood's own internal systems. In that recording, Damien could be heard telling Evelyn plainly that she did not need to win the case outright, only delay the Horizon Care contract long enough to collapse the company's valuation. Once that valuation fell far enough, he explained calmly, on the recording, Nolan would have no choice left but to sell the company on Blackwood's own preferred terms. Evelyn, the recording confirmed, would only receive her promised payment after Blackwood successfully gained full control over the underlying technology. Her voice was clearly audible near the end of the recording, saying that all that mattered was that Nolan lose the very thing that made him believe he no longer needed her in his life. The presiding judge turned directly toward Evelyn and asked a single pointed question that silenced the entire courtroom completely. She asked whether Evelyn was truly seeking rightful ownership of a company, or whether she was instead asking the court to punish a man simply for building a good life after she chose to leave him. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to find any honest answer that did not expose the real motive behind her lawsuit. Several tense days later, the court delivered its full ruling, addressing every disputed claim raised throughout the extensive trial with careful, methodical precision. The judge found that Evelyn was not, and had never been, a legitimate co-founder of Aster Mobility under any reasonable interpretation of the evidence presented. No credible proof existed showing she had contributed meaningfully to the design process at any stage of its development. The legitimate working prototype had been created entirely after the couple's legal separation, funded solely through Nolan's private settlement money and an independent rehabilitation grant. The disputed founder agreement was formally declared a fraudulent document, its signature proven to have been copied directly from an unrelated medical consent form. The court further determined that the entire lawsuit had been strategically used as leverage to apply improper commercial pressure against a competing company. Evelyn's demand for a share of company ownership was formally denied in its entirety, and the earlier restraining order blocking company transactions was immediately lifted. Because the court found clear evidence of bad faith litigation, Evelyn and her litigation funder were both ordered to cover a significant portion of the legal costs involved. All documents connecting Damien Blackwood to the lawsuit were forwarded directly to regulatory authorities and to his own company's board of directors for further review. News of the ruling spread quickly through the small legal community in Briar Glen, and reporters who had barely noticed the case a week earlier suddenly wanted quotes from everyone involved. Nolan declined most of the interview requests, preferring instead to spend that first free evening quietly at home with Lila rather than in front of a camera. After examining the full ruling, Horizon Care extended its original deadline allowing Nolan additional time to finalize the long-delayed partnership agreement properly. Blackwood's board swiftly suspended Damien himself pending a formal investigation into market interference, the use of shell companies, and possible misappropriation of confidential trade information. With Damien's financial backing suddenly gone, Evelyn found herself standing entirely alone outside the courthouse for the very first time in months. She approached Nolan briefly on the courthouse steps, telling him bitterly that he had taken away her one last real chance to finally start her life over again. Nolan replied calmly that she had already been given that exact chance 7 years earlier, the day she chose to walk out their front door. What she never had any right to do, he told her quietly, was return years later and attempt to claim ownership over a life someone else had built entirely alone. Evelyn then asked, almost fearfully, whether Nolan intended to prevent her from ever seeing their daughter again as a form of punishment. Nolan made it clear he would not use his legal victory as an act of revenge against her regarding matters involving Lila. He explained that any future arrangement concerning their daughter would be handled separately, based solely on stability and Lila's own genuine well-being going forward. He added, without cruelty, but without softness either, that Evelyn would need to demonstrate consistent, long-term presence through real action, not through a single dramatic reappearance after 7 years of silence. Nolan walked down the courthouse steps that afternoon, surrounded by reporters eager for a statement about the surprising outcome of his case. With so many cameras watching, he chose to use his cane openly rather than attempt to hide it as he once might have done. For the very first time in years, Nolan realized the cane no longer made him feel small, weak, or somehow incomplete in front of other people. As he reached his car, Leah's phone rang sharply, and her expression shifted instantly into something close to relief, mixed with genuine excitement. Horizon Care had officially approved the full nationwide partnership agreement, finalizing the contract Nolan had fought so hard and so long to protect. Before signing, however, Nolan insisted on adding one final new condition, requiring that a portion of every shipment be reserved specifically for community rehabilitation centers unable to afford full pricing. 6 months later, Astor Mobility opened a brand new training and rehabilitation center, built entirely with its own resources rather than any outside corporate money. The company was never sold to Blackwood Biomechanics, and Jonas remained in charge of the same manufacturing workshop where everything had originally begun. Celeste now led the company's medical advisory board, while Leah helped design new legal protections, specifically meant for small independent inventors facing similar battles. Nolan personally created a support program for patients hoping to transform their own recovery experiences into helpful new inventions of their own. Lila attended the opening ceremony quietly, standing near her father rather than in front of any cameras or reporters gathered outside. She placed the small hinge from the very first working prototype inside a glass display case near the main entrance of the building. Beneath that hinge, the accompanying plaque did not describe Nolan as a man who had heroically overcome his disability against impossible odds. Instead, it simply read that the device had been created by a man who needed a solution and refused to wait for someone else to provide it for him. Weeks later, Evelyn sent Nolan a short letter, admitting that she had spent years wrongly believing her own departure had somehow caused his eventual success. Nolan did not respond right away, setting the letter carefully inside a drawer, not because he had fully forgiven her, but because he no longer required her regret to confirm his own worth. Leah invited him to coffee following the opening ceremony, and Nolan accepted without hesitation, though neither of them rushed to call it anything more than what it was. He wanted to enter any future relationship because he genuinely chose to, not because he needed someone to fill a space left empty long ago. The building had gone quiet by then. The overhead lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the faint hum of the ventilation system was the only sound left echoing through the empty hallway. Once the last of the guests had gone home, Nolan walked quietly into the training area, where a new patient stood nervously between two parallel support bars. Fear was written clearly across the young man's face as he stared down at the small, uncertain distance he was about to attempt to cross. Nolan did not promise him that the road ahead would be easy, because he understood far too well that some promises should never be made lightly. He simply stood in front of the man and told him gently that he did not need to travel far, that today, one single step would be more than enough. The patient took that first careful step, and Nolan stepped back slightly, quietly making room for him to continue on his own. His cane remained steady in his hand, but for the first time in a very long while, his back stood completely, effortlessly straight. 7 years earlier, Evelyn had walked away believing Nolan's life was already finished, the moment he could no longer cross a simple hospital room. Now, standing in the very center of the life he had rebuilt piece by piece, Nolan finally understood something far more important than any single victory. His life had not been rebuilt on the day he first stood upright, or the day his company found success, or even the day the court ruled firmly in his favor. It had been rebuilt in the quiet, private moment he finally stopped believing that someone else's decision to leave could ever define the true value of everything still ahead of him.
Nice. Is it only one phase? Okay, you know what, bro? Fuck that shit. I'm going back to the other one. I'm going back to pillar stance. Oh, that's so annoying. Oh my god. Damn, bro. Oh my